Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon, co-author with Peter Vale of the digital book on Practice as a Way of Being. Find it at mylibrary.world. And now to our show. Folks, I want you to remember the term edge walkers, because that's where I met Sean Harvey, with whom I'm having this conversation. Judy Neal is a colleague and friend of both of ours, who perhaps even coined that term. If she didn't, she certainly lives it. And she has promoted the opening of our hearts and minds to spirit and its ability to help us make positive change, now reaching out all over the world. And but Sean and I were introduced by Judy to an interesting connection, which is that way back in his earlier journey, he and Judy collaborated on some work with the Eileen Fisher brand and company. So, Sean, welcome. And what do you remember about that moment that you were in the Eileen Fisher world?
Well, I was the head of personal transformation and well-being for the company. So I was, and I was the internal change agent for creative. It's really, it's probably the first place where I've worked where I really saw a spiritual connection in the culture. And actually, as Judy and I were co-authoring an article called Nurturing the Soul of the Company at Eileen Fisher for the Journal of Management, Spirituality, and Religion, I asked employees, what do you see as the soul of the company? And folks would just say, well, it's Eileen. And
that's interesting.
They would say she values the deep intuitive knowing more than empirically based data. And she built a $500 million company based on that trusting in the deep intuitive knowing. And that struck me. And the other thing that struck me working there was seeing how in a company that was 87% women, men were being transformed through the feminine. And that was actually the foundation of the work that I do now, taking what I learned at Eileen Fisher and how men were being transformed, and I bring those into hypermasculine systems in police, first responders, defense, military, government, finance, tech, energy, construction. In those types of environments, I'm bringing a compassionate approach, a healing approach to the leaders in the organization, to the cultures, and really helping to think about how do you bring deeper humanity into their systems.
Wow. It's really interesting that you can roll back to that period of your life where you observed the very few percentage of men being opened to a larger nature that I can tell you is one of the gang of men that, it's as much as I've tried to expand my own awareness in nature and acceptance, it's still pretty crusty. And but I did mention to you just before we started that when I was attending the session that Eileen Fisher attended, perhaps you and Judy, at our management professor academy meeting, I was very much drawn to the messages, the images, the examples of the fashion that were brought to us that time. I think back then we didn't have much technology. I think you actually had to bring a few garments with you which is from my standpoint a lot better because it's tactile. But now we're talking about an era some many years ago where I think the maleness has become even more impacted. That's just my sense of it. That the professions you mentioned and the occupations you mentioned have tended to constantly reinforce that, I don't know what you'd call it, tough And so I look at the warrior compassion notion in your brand, and I think, how do you deal with tough? And let me ask you this: is it tougher now than it was when you first started this work? Are men toughened out to reject, if you will, spirit?
I mean, I think in the last 5 years, I've seen an openness less than a toughening.
Good news.
Yeah, no, no, no. I mean, but I also, let's see, there's a few different ways to look at it. Now, I was just I was with my ex-boyfriend, who's a ultra-conservative MAGA Republican. I immersed myself in the far-right echo chamber for 9 months. And so I was able to see, what the masculinity conversation looks like in progressive circles, moderate circles, and ultra-conservative circles.
Mm,
And so I think there's a taking back in the conservative realm of let's get back to strength and manliness and let's not make our men weak. I think in progressive circles, whereas in spiritual circles, I think we're seeing how do you embrace the masculine in a new way when there's been a lot of demonizing of the masculine in a lot of conscious communities.
that's true.
And
Yeah.
so I think we're my sense is because I tend to be a bridge builder between the left and the right. And I work with a fair number of white nationalists and far right extremists in my work. And so how to invite them into soul healing work is different than how I would approach and invite a progressive. But at the same time, I'm learning what is the language, what is the approach, what is the way in to be able to reach across the polarized divides that we have in this country and around the world, and create a new type of conversation, a new way of connecting, and walking from a place of curiosity and humility on the extremes to be able to come into ultimately. I think what's universal is the suffering that men are experiencing across the board from a place of the epidemic of loneliness, the epidemic of isolation, the um the feeling of disconnection from self, other, and spirit, and
Wow.
yearning for a deeper sense of connection. And often that is, and I take men out on soul adventures, connecting outdoor adventure with deeper male bonding and soul connecting conversations, be it existential, philosophical, or spiritual awakening discussions, which I just call practical spirituality for dudes. Because I think what I find is a lot of men, because as an interfaith minister now, what I find is a lot of men just have questions around
Yeah.
faith, questions around spirituality. They have questions around, and I'll be running a seminar later that blends sexuality and spirituality for men as a way to look at ways to deepen the sense of intimacy that men are yearning for. So I think within the work, it's the way I often describe it, especially as a queer progressive New Yorker working with white nationalists and extremists. Having done my work to be able to see these men in their humanity, even if I disagree or even abhor their views, what I see is that those views they're creating a life of suffering.
Hmm.
So as opposed to meeting men where they are, which I think can be very condescending, I always say I meet men in their suffering, I listen for their yearning, and I offer hope in the midst of both.
I'm breathless, honestly, because I'm picturing some of the men uh, in that extreme guys, if you will, because I think the costuming of the far right, the tattoos and all the rest that are supposed to communicate that I'm a part. I don't want to look like the
Let
guy
me
down the street, and I think,
let
but
me
underneath the skin and all that is someone who's the guy down the street, just dressed
no, no,
differently
no.
in a sense.
Let me clarify something because the far right has infiltrated our power centers.
Yeah.
And so the extremists that I've met look like me. They don't look like what you're describing. It's not the neo-Nazis of the past have evolved into mainstreaming themselves in a way that it's a very different environment in terms of the ways they've been infiltrating. And so they will look like everyone else. I mean, my ex would probably fit into that category and is very mainstream, you know? And so I think there's, it's the what I was able to do in both in my relationship and as I walked in his world for that time, um, was really get a better sense of the deep-seated fears that are underlying the anger, the rage, and the hate,
Mhm.
right? And to really understand what the values are, what these men value, what these men fear, what these men want to protect, and the the tribal connection that they are seeking that they can find in the far right. Because in America, I heard the average, it takes an average of about 90 days to indoctrinate to the far right. And so, and now I meet men who are somewhere on that continuum, young men who find themselves feeling a sense of belonging in those worlds because the messages are speaking to them and their experience.
Yeah.
So I think, to your earlier question, I think where we're at right now is not a toughening. I think there's more of a frustration. I think there's more confusion. I think there's more fear. I think there's more seeking connection. I think there's more mental health issues, partly because of the way men are conditioned, but also what was exasperated from the pandemic. And then all that was happening alongside the pandemic in terms of what they were seeing and what was happening under the last administration, and what was being lifted up in terms of the places of oppression in our country in so many different ways that were agitating a lot of folks in terms of, either being the agitators of it or not being included in it, and so the messages, I think, um, I think this does come down to messaging, and I think the far right and the moderate left, right of center have really been able to speak a message to speak to these men across educational levels.
What would be an example of such a message that would give them give them a little, maybe even hope?
I'm not thinking of any particular message,
More
but
themes?
I think no, the themes though, I think there's two that come to mind. One, it's okay to be politically incorrect. And then two, seeing the value, so telling white straight men they are okay and they are welcomed in this world, and that when everyone else is telling them that it's wrong to be a white straight male. So I was leading diversity work while I was in my relationship, and my ex would say, "Your work says that you hate straight men, white straight guys, or you hate white men." Like that was how it was interpreted. Your work
Yeah,
of inclusion means you hate white men.
yeah, I get
And
it.
that was pretty consistent when I would talk with others in his circles around what are you doing to the white man? Why are you diminishing? Why are you? And so in this, talking about power and privilege and having a reckoning for white folks around the ways the systems are oppressive to those of color and those of, any marginalized group, that liberation of these other communities feels like a diminishing to those in the power class, the dominant class, the mainstream.
Wow. No wonder I end up at the end of the day more confused than the beginning. And that's good because I'm an observer, right? I pay attention to best I can, being retired and sitting in prosaic northwestern Connecticut. But through these conversations and other Edgewalker and other places that I can join via Zoom, I am I'm aware of these cross currents much more than even when I was teaching the organizational behavior realm. And because in even early 2018, 16, down around then, when Peter Vale and I reconnected, it was we saw a lot of churn and tapped into some of the angst, but we were puzzled.
Right.
And now I'm intrigued but confused. And maybe I'm channeling. That's a kind of a cranky word, but I'm channeling what any one of the persons with whom you're having these deep conversations is feeling. Like I'm dislodged. I
Right.
can't. I'm looking down. I can't see where to put my feet. If I plunk them down, that puts me with a certain association of people and affiliation. And then I plunk down and I realize, hey, wait, I'm more than that. They want me to condense into who they want to brand me as a human being. So I try to rise up and float and see where else I might fit.
Right.
And wow, and there's loneliness, there's confusion, uh, but in all cases, back to you, Sean, in every case, there's a soul.
You know,
So
it's a,
while the physical aspect is trying to locate and co-locate and socialize and everything, to me, the constant is that we all have a soul.
right.
Is that what you work with?
You know, you just took me back because I was an org behavior, org change professor for 10 years.
Yeah,
So
there you go.
being able to, again, in the evolution, you know, when I got the call, when I heard the call, the spiritual call to work with men, I knew this work had to be done at a soul level, right? If we were really going to, because for me, as a systems thinker, I just worked backwards from, okay, the oppressive systems are crumbling. They need to be reimagined, not updated on an outdated model, but reimagined from a place of deeper consciousness and collective wisdom. What
Yes.
is the Achilles heel to that? White men in power holding on to power from a place of wounding, not a place of healing. So let's go to that place and create healing for those leaders to start to transform the systems and go system by system by system by system as a way to start to create societal systems change. So at least that's what's in my head. So from an org behavior, org change standpoint, you know, I just think about this from a systems perspective in every aspect, which is what makes me different than a lot of other men in men's work.
I
And
think
then
so, yeah.
and then knowing that, you know, Eileen Fisher sent me to an artist commune for 5 months in Canada to learn how to incorporate the arts into creative facilitation. That's where I heard the call, and that's also where I knew the room can only go as deep as the facilitator is capable. So if I'm going to work with men, I have to go to the deepest levels possible. And I just knew my own intuitive knowing was that the deepest yearning for most men is soul connection. And so to be able to bring soul healing to create an outlet, an opening for soul connection, to then be able to understand one's own truth that is their own divinity to come through and to be able to help those leaders access that to then start to bring a level of love, compassion, and deeper humanity into their systems that is spiritually grounded and spiritually based.
Wow. I keep saying wow. But I remember at Colby College when I was a student, long before you were born, probably, uh, we had something called the January Plan,
Mm-hmm.
and that we had a month of independent study,
Mm-hmm.
between semesters. So of all things, I chose to figure out for myself what the soul is. Like it's a thing. I wanted to find the soul. We had a great library. I had Gustav Todrank, who was a wonderful theologian and my professor who guided the study. And I remember him sitting down with him at the beginning. He said, David, uh, if you start this, take a lot of notes, but if you start this now, realize that you're going to end up at the end of January far more confused than you are today. And then he said, and that's a good thing. And he was right. I mean, we didn't have the search tools back then. It was card catalogs and reading and thinking and observing. But I hear you now, Sean, and I tapping right back 60 years ago into my yearning, my personal yearning to intellectually understand the soul. And that's where Gustav finally, who gave me a very nice compliment on the paper that I wrote, he said, "You realize now that these are just words on paper, but have you changed?" And I said, "Yes, I have." I really have. And my old congregational ancestors are all sort of looking at me and saying, "Hey, Dave, we had it pretty well figured out. We had a nice contained system for your religious life, and now you've busted it open and you're looking at back then in the 60s, you're looking at social unrest, you're looking at yearnings, you're looking at anger, demonstration, but you're seeing soul in all of that. So,
Right.
hey, there we are."
Yeah. Well, because I think as you're talking, and as I train facilitators, as I train what I call my army of covert operatives, bringing spirituality into communities, organizations, hypermasculine systems, and the power centers. I often will redirect when we are over intellectualizing what this is
Yeah.
to move to the visceral felt experience and the embodiment of what this means to be. Now, I want to go back to your question before we even got on here because I'm curious what your question was when you heard the words warrior compassion that you wanted to ask me.
Yeah.
What was that question?
Compassion is easy, but the warrior, of course, is all the movies we ever saw as kids, spears and swords and attack and win at all costs, human cost, which is still unfortunately going on to this day. So it was an interesting juxtaposition of those two. I think of them as sentiments, the warrior sentiment and the compassion sentiment. But what I've heard so far in meeting you, Sean, in this conversation is you're drawn to those who perhaps are leaning heavily on the warrior side of their choices, and you're meeting them and drawing together with them and seeing what comes out of that.
So I want to break it down though. I want to break it down with you.
Okay.
So one, it was part of it was a recommendation from my publisher because it will sell books. Let's just put that out of the way.
You're right.
But why? So the book was originally going to be called Compassion Makes the Warrior, which was the name of my TED Talk. But my publisher said, well, that's too many words. I'm like, it's 2 words. It's like, that's too many words. Get it down to 2 words. So I want you to think about it from 2 ways. The first thing I proposed was compassionate warrior. And then we switched it to warrior compassion. Now, when you think about it, and what I describe in the book, a compassionate warrior fits more into what you're describing. Because it's asking, because the focus is on the warrior and the descriptor is compassion. Right? So it's still an identity that we can claim. And what I realize is most men are not going to claim the identity of a compassionate warrior. That will feel weak to many of them. But when you flip it around to warrior compassion, compassion is the focus. That's the noun. It's being described by the fierce warrior energy that activates compassion and gives men the courage to look within themselves, especially at their shadow, their shame, their fear, their anger, their unresolved anger, and their uncontrollable rage. And so when they can have the courage at a fierce level that activates the compassion to help them learn how to love in a new way, so warrior compassion is actually an activating energy that all men possess within themselves when they do the inner work to unlock it.
It works. I mean, I get it.
Yeah,
Your publisher w- hit it, perhaps a different motive for the two words,
yeah,
but
exactly.
the way you've just described them works a lot because what I've experienced is the it's a heavy lift to change ourselves in any way,
Right.
lose weight, do whatever we need to do. It we always underestimate, from my standpoint, how much raw courage and concentration and humility it takes to bring about a personal change, which would be the case of these men you're helping.
I want
Uh,
I want to
so
offer.
coming at it fiercely is not a bad idea.
Well, and it's also who's the audience.
Yeah.
Because my world, I started out on Wall Street and then went to Eileen Fisher and then went to now working in hypermasculine systems. So basically, started in hypermasculine as a professor at Cornell and NYU and Baruch, did consulting with Wall Street firms, left all that at 40, went to work for Eileen Fisher, was transformed by the culture of Eileen Fisher, became a minister. And then what came back was working in hypermasculine systems, like working in the most hypermasculine systems on the planet. So a softer approach is not the way in to these
No,
audiences,
no.
right? And so to give example, in my work that's really starting to become the foundation of building what I like to call, it's a community, but I like to say the army because I, like to be dramatic. But it really came from a request from like the bones of that program came from a request from Goldman Sachs. And Goldman
Hmm.
Sachs asked, can you train our global change agents to be more vulnerable so we can create more vulnerability in the culture of Goldman Sachs? Another request I received, a defense missiles company that makes defense missiles for our military, said, can you talk to our bomb making engineers about how to be more compassionate, but do it through a military voice? And then we just got landed a project with the FDNY to train New York's bravest. And the determining factor of why they wanted us was my work around compassion. And they asked me, they said, so how will you bring compassion to our firefighters?
To them.
Yeah. And I said, well, we have to first stop talking about how to be more compassionate and start with where do you need compassion?
Yeah.
And what I do is in my book, in the work I do, I just start to list the ways that men are suffering. And they just start going, yep, that's me. You start seeing the nods when you list it
There
off.
you go.
And
There
when
you
you
go.
start to see yourself from a place of, I could use some compassion. And when we just look at the purest definition of being able to recognize and have a desire to alleviate the suffering for ourselves or others, there is nothing feminine or emasculating in that definition.
Yeah.
However, we have lost the essence of what it truly means. And so even in my book, I take every major faith tradition and say, how do they define compassion? And really tap into the spiritual roots. And that's why I also love the work of compassion, because it straddles the secular to the spiritual. And I can speak to the hardest atheist to the most evangelical Christian or Muslim or Orthodox Jewish person and be able to still go that I'm going to not talk to your dogma. I'm going to talk to the spirit within you and your own divinity within you that brings you to a place of your spiritual truth.
Wow. I think of the places, Goldman Sachs and others you've mentioned, and being an outsider looking in, I think I hear the song in Don Quixote, dream the impossible dream, you know, to right the unrightable wrong. There's something about that. In fact, I love the Peter O'Toole, I believe his name, who played that in the last next in his death scene. And Dulcinea, the prostitute whom he named that, comes to his bedside, and his loved ones are around, and she reminds him how much he meant to her just by accepting her, seeing her not as a prostitute, not as a
Right.
and seeing her beauty, even Sophia Loren played her, but the beauty of beauty, and then he sort of rises out, and his eyes light up again, and he's up on his feet, and he's saying, "Pacho, got my sword and shield," and he's ready to go again. And then he dies. He flops on the floor, and he's done. But I share that with my students. I used a lot of clips. Maybe you did back then in the day, where you've got to show them, at least dramatize human behavior in order to get them to feel that connection. And that I think my message at the end of that particular segment was, is it really impossible?
Right.
What has made anything impossible? And so your job going forward into the world as young business persons is to dream and go for it, and maybe you're going to be picked on and laughed at and scorned and all the rest. But that's how big change happens. So here you are, the Don Quixote of Goldman Sachs.
Well, I want to
No, I
challenge.
didn't mean to tag you like that.
No. But I want to challenge what you're saying a little bit, if I can.
Sure.
I've been doing this for 8 years, and I've never been challenged, ridiculed, or laughed at, or so one of the guys on my team, on my police team, is the former head of the FBI National Academy at Quantico. So I work with FBI agents, I work with military officers. And so dude is like Christian Republican, was the firearms trainer for the FBI. So I thought, okay, we're gonna butt heads on this team. So let me just reach out, extend an olive branch, and say, hey, let's have a conversation, just get to know each other. We talked for 2.5 hours. And I'm talking about helping cops get in touch with their feminine, and like coming, like I talk about going to an artist commune. Like I'm talking about all this crazy stuff that happened at Eileen Fisher and the unique perspective that I bring into this work. And you know what he said to me at the end? He said, Sean, I can't, 2.5 hours of this conversation of me just being Sean, I can't argue, refute, or rebut anything you've just said. You're not talking about training cops to be better cops. You're talking about developing officers into better humans. Who can argue?
I like that. That was a good take.
And so all of my conversations have been consistently, because when you talk to someone's spirit, they can hear the message. I think where we're getting it wrong in so many of our initiatives to create social justice is that we are moving so forcefully to the justice part, we're forgetting the human part. And
Absolutely.
The human ego and the relaxation of the human ego that needs to come to a place of calm to be able to receive the message of the ways that might be part of, complicit in, or exasperating an unjust world. So if we just like flip the switch and go from personal transformation to then looking at the realities of our world, to looking at how can we be part of changing that, that may be a very different type of conversation that can activate social justice in a very different way. But right now, we are losing a whole segment of our population who aren't buying into the ways to be part of a more just world, probably because they feel like they're being rejected from that world.
Yeah, to hear you say that from your very comprehensive point of view, you've seen a lot. And that point you made earlier, and now I'm making again, about the upcoming generation, they're in their teens or early 20s. I think of the the demonstrations at the various elite colleges, including Cornell and Columbia and schools are
You can.
in your orbit. And I think I don't know how much information of any factual nature they really had and have when they pulled together and put up the tents and did all that. But I do know this. I think I know this. They were not at all certain of any institution's ability to rectify that problem, the problem between Israel and Gaza and all the rest.
Right.
It was more a protest, more a lament from my standpoint
Right.
that nothing could be done. And this notion of, taking away the stock support of Israel, I mean, that's an old idea. We're somewhat worked with apartheid, but there's a lot more
Right.
anti-apartheid work that went on in my youth, in my college time.
Right.
But still, it's that where do we go? I mean, this is back to that feeling of I have no place to put my feet. Do I want to work at Goldman Sachs? They want to give me a lot of money when I graduate. Do I want to do what do I want to do? Who do I want to be? And now, of course, throwing them apart during the pandemic, so they barely had a chance to have a human conversation with each other. It gives us a pretty troubled generation coming forward. But there's you and your belief that we can reach them at the soul level. So maybe it's not lost after all.
Yeah, I think at this point, what's happening on college campuses is about so much more than what's happening in Gaza and Israel.
Mhm.
I think we've seen these iterations from Occupy Wall Street to Black Lives Matter, George Floyd. It feels like we're in this escalation, and this is a culmination of a burning anger that has been the flame has been growing from incident to incident. So I think that my feeling on it is this is much more than just what's happening in the situation in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And it's creating an opening to be able to have the channel for that anger, for that rage, for that feeling of injustice, the feeling of oppression, and the feeling of, and seeing so many people being murdered, being killed on both sides, right? Um, and so again, it's like, what is that anger? What is that rage? And what's beneath it? And I think to your point, so much of this work is about being able to tap in and connect to the soul, be able to listen to the soul's call, to be able to get on a path. I think in our world, often I meet, and I often say if I had a flock as a minister, my flock would be the atheists, the agnostics, and the spiritual non-religious. Those who are looking for spiritual, something on a deeper level than what's offered now, and a sense of community that faith-based organizations can provide that are lacking when you leave a church, or you're not part of a church, you're not part of that community, and that level of authenticity, that level of vulnerability, that level of magic, that level of mysticism, being able to experience and be part of and connect with that. I think that's part of, we have many splinters. We have, I'm part of the psychedelic world. I see what's going on there. I'm part of the conscious community and the intimacy circles and in all these different ways, we're trying to create that sense, but we're not naming, we're not being explicit about what is the real yearning. And I think it is really the yearning that our soul is calling within us, that is asking us to come forth and be a reflection of our truest nature.
Yeah. I I feel what you're saying. I really do. And but another part of my head, the managerial mind, is thinking, okay, now how do we organize to capture yearning, and how do we channel that yearning, and how do we service that yearning, and so, oh, I know, we'll create a new church, or we'll create a new we'll organize a new political movement. That's sort of our way, isn't it? As human ness is also societal, and we want to provide structures for people to accomplish anything, really. So, but to me, that's back to your warrior compassion. Structured freedom, structured yearning. I don't get it. So I see warrior more structure and compassion free float. So I've got to get another hour out of you to get my head straight on this. But what's your thought?
But I think from an OD perspective, from a systems change perspective, I think we're at a point that folks are starting to find each other. I think, one of the things that I find is, well, as you do your awakening work, your conscious work, you raise the level of, can you hold on a second? Oh, you raise the level of connection to you raise the level of connection to see each other, to see each other's light. And I think that, because as you're talking, I'm thinking about liberating structures.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the work that's being done to say, like, we have holacracy, we have new types of systems and structures that are coming that are defying traditional hierarchy.
That's true.
Right. And I don't think that it is in my faith, we talked about ministering as a verb. And so from that perspective, we don't necessarily need a church. We don't need another structure. We need a new way for folks to organize and feel that connection. And I think you may start to see that other types of connections are created. But I think, again, not rebuilding on outdated models, reimagining what's possible from deeper consciousness and collective wisdom. But I think we had to get to that place of openness to actually let go, and the courage to let go of what we had to create space for what the universe, what God, what the divine wants us to create.
Divine within, divine writ large, but there's untapped potential for this generation we're talking about, and my generation. We're in the 80s. We were called the lost generation, which I thought was a weird thing to call us, because we knew where we were. But now we're living into our 90s, even 100. So we've got a whole period of time where we have, I think, much more awareness of our divine nature, because we're so close. On the other hand, we're looking for places to be where we can connect with people who are in need, like you are. So, call it the grandparent syndrome, however you want to call it. There's that need too. So there's a lot of undisclosed yet soon to be disclosed ability for us to relate to each other in a non-institutional way. And I'm excited you're doing this work. And I would love to keep going, but you're a busy guy, and we will reconnect, I promise you. I want everyone to know. So, again, the book, according to its wisdom of its publishers, called Warrior Compassion. The work that I'll have on the description for this podcast is very much available at LinkedIn for Sean Harvey. And just one day, if you walk into an arena and you find people are a little kinder, a little happier, a little more welcoming than you expected them to be, given their whatever their dress or their orientation or whatever, and you go, well, I never expected this. Let's give Sean Harvey credit, and now the thousands of people who are connected through the Edgewalker to this belief in the spirit. So thank you, Sean Harvey.
Thank you so much. It was great to be with you.
Thank you for listening to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. If you'd like to hear more, go to Automatic, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. And please consider purchasing our book on practice as a way of being at mylibrary.world. It's a digital book with lots of features that you do not see in a conventional book. So once again, thank you, and I look forward to you listening again.